Welcome back. I hope you all sufficiently caffeinated. It was a quick sprint of coffee. So as I said, the next part of our day, we will look at a panel now just looking at copper and its role in U.S. economic security. We'll then move on to a fireside discussion with Representative Ami Bera from the House Foreign Affairs Committee. I'm really excited about this panel because I think it comes from a very different vantage point as the previous fireside discussion. Earlier this morning, you heard Jasper tell you he needs two post boxes worth of yttrium. Rare earths is a very, very small market. And the tools, the support, the economics are totally different from some of your larger scale base metals. When we think about copper, copper is so inextricably linked to economic security. And in a time when, generally mineral prices have been very low, we see that with lithium, nickel, cobalt, prices are down between 60 and 80% over the last 3 years. Copper is a different narrative. You saw prices in the last few years climb to record highs. And a lot of that is because copper is used in every form of technology. It is used in your pipes and your wires. It is used in transmission infrastructure. It's used in exorbitant amounts for data centers and AI. It's the second most used weight in defense technology by weight. So when you look at the world going forward, it's hard to see us do that in any way without more copper. So I'm really delighted to be joined by some of my favorite friends on this panel. I say that about every panel, but especially this panel. To my left is Seth Levey. Seth heads the U.S. government relations and corporate affairs for Glencore, where he leads stakeholder engagement, public affairs, policy development, and advocacy strategy. Seth's background spans international energy and public policy, and he previously held positions at Equinor, Edison Electric Institute, and ExxonMobil. To his left is JJ Young. JJ is Vice President of Federal Government Relations and International Affairs at Freeport-McMoRan, America's largest copper producer, where he oversees the company's domestic U.S. political activity and global stakeholder engagement. JJ has over 2 decades of public and private sector experience, including Chevron and the U.S. government. And to his left is Dominic Perrottet. Dom is the Vice President of International Affairs and the United States at BHP, which is the world's largest copper company. So we have some good friendly competitors on this panel. He oversees the company's international operations and engagement. He's the former Premier of New South Wales in Australia, where he led one of the largest state economies and advanced major reforms across infrastructure, energy, and economic policy. Thank you so much for joining us today. So I want to get started. I'm going to let's set the table a little bit for our audience. Copper, as I said, is a large-scale commodity. Global demand is expected to nearly double by 2050, and that's coming off of a pretty significant demand signal right now. What is the single most underestimated demand driver or underappreciated when we talk about copper's role in economic security? Seth?
Sure. Well, great to see everybody and see a lot of familiar faces in the audience. Good morning. Happy Monday. In terms of copper, the obvious one is going to be the AI, the data center trend. I think we can't forget that construction still uses a lot of copper. We can't forget that, as you mentioned, every single piece of equipment in this room probably has copper in it. Your phones have copper in it. Your cars have copper in it. So actually, for me, the underestimated demand driver is just everyday life. When you actually think about copper, it is everywhere. And so I think there are a lot of episodic attention is driven toward things like AI, EVs over the last few years, but we need to remember that it's literally in everything.
JJ.
Yeah, thanks. Good morning, everyone. Good to see you all. To put a finer point on kind of the AI piece, Seth's absolutely right. It's the industrial use, it's the new energy technologies, it's the EV, it's all that. But I think the big question facing us is how much more copper is AI going to demand? And, the numbers are quite staggering when you look about it. This panel originally was supposed to talk about AI, so I actually did some digging around, but new AI data centers require 27 metric tons of copper per megawatt of installed capacity, according to Bloomberg. And then a single AI hyperscale center can require 45,000 metric tons per facility. So you're looking at, as those are building out across the country, across the world, the copper that's used for the cooling, for thermal management, for the grid, for all that, So the question is how much more? And I think people are just starting to scratch at that question, so.
Did you say 45,000 tons?
45,000 metric tons, yeah.
Yeah, so you need, a car weighs like 2 tons, right? So when you think about needing 22,500 tons of copper per car's worth of copper, that's a lot per facility. Dom.
Thanks, Grace, and good morning, everybody. Fantastic to be here on a Monday. I agree with, obviously, Seth and JJ, and I think, obviously, from a perspective of AI and data centres, that's going to take a real path as we move forward. And obviously, JJ's put some statistics there in relation to the growing demand and the importance of copper as we move through this new technological age. But, to Seth's point, I think let's not forget that copper's still going to be required in everyday life. Urbanisation, electrification, industrialisation as it continues, as the world grows, and particularly developing countries continue to have higher standards of living, more housing comes on. As part more infrastructure is built. Take India, for example. If you look at electricity consumption in India today, it's about 1/7 of Japan, it's about 1/5 of China. And that's only going to continue to grow. And when you bring on housing, you bring on refrigeration, you bring on air conditioning, and as JJ said, copper is part of everyday life, and it's going to be needed more and more as we move forward. And yes, there's a major focus when it comes to copper on AI and data centres, and that's just natural because these are emerging trends. But ultimately today, if you look at that demand doubling by 2050 for copper, today 90% of that is still in traditional means in terms of demand for copper. Now, yes, there's going to be a substantial increase with AI and data centres from about 2% to 7%. But ultimately, as the world continues to develop, that's going to really continue to increase demand for copper. So it's incredibly important that governments around the world continue to do what they can to ensure that copper is extracted as quickly as possible, and our 3 companies are here to help with that.
Can I just add one more point? This AI revolution, as well as the EV battery race of the last few years, coupled with COVID and all the supply chain dynamics, really has put a spotlight on what has been the case forever. If we had this event 10 years ago, there'd be 6 people having Chick-fil-A in a back room. But now, because of everything happening after COVID, AI, et cetera, there's a spotlight on this dynamic. And so we just need to remember that no matter what happens with AI, copper is in everything. It's not an optional commodity.
So if the demand outlook is as good as it seems, right, for copper, and what are the commercial constraints to scaling up copper production?
Well, the obvious one, and we're probably all going to say it, is permitting reform, permitting issues, at least here in the US and probably some other key jurisdictions around the West. The oft-used statistic is 29 years to build a new mine. I'll speak for Glencore in terms of our own experience here. We have a very exciting project in the northeast of Minnesota called New Range Copper Nickel. It is a multi-generational opportunity in the Iron Range of Minnesota. It's a multi-metallic deposit. It's copper, nickel, PGMs, et cetera. We've been in the permitting process there for 15 years. Enormous amounts of money have been spent. We are dedicated to the project, as is our JV partner, Tech Resources. But why should that take so long to get through? When we all know that there is a demand issue here, we all know that we need more supply online, we all want more American supply of these materials, yet the body politic has moved so incredibly slowly, just because of the broader dynamics we're all aware of in our politics, to get any sort of permitting reform through. So that's just the federal side of things. You layer on that the state dynamic, it gets quite complicated. So I think as a society, we need to really consider, do we actually want to build things, or do we want to admire the problem? And that's, I think, the key driver here.
And it was interesting because in our opening fireside today was Jared Agan from the White House, and he talked about how judicial reform and permitting reform are really key to advancing this agenda at this point, because without that, we're not going to get these projects off the ground. JJ, what's the most binding commercial constraint to getting what the copper.
Yeah, thinking about that, agree with Seth. I will add kind of the price of the commodity. It was Raheem from BMO earlier this morning talking about price matters for commodities. Same with copper. So you don't get a sustained high price of copper. It makes making additional investments difficult because obviously things have to pencil. The long investment timeframes, the long lead times, you want to know that the price for that commodity, for copper in our case, you'll get the adequate return on investment. So at the end of the day, you need high prices to kind of sustain that investment.
Well, unfortunately, we're all saying the same thing. You wanted some diversity of views with diversity of companies. I'll add energy. I'll go back to permitting reform, but energy costs as well. I think that's a major issue facing companies around the world. When you've got these major operations, they require a lot of energy, and particularly in Western jurisdictions, you're seeing substantive increase in energy prices because there hasn't really been clarity around the policy settings, debates between net zero and traditional means of energy. And I think where the challenge lies there is because you've had these political debates on the left and the right in relation to it, it hasn't provided policy certainty to put energy prices down across the board. So when you're talking about these major investments that companies are making in relation to resource extraction, energy prices are a key part of that. So getting greater clarity in jurisdictions around the world when it comes to the policy settings will help, I think, bring down energy costs, and that will help drive capital investment across the board. I mean, obviously, I agree with both Seth and JJ in relation to permitting reform. Seth mentioned admiration of the problem. I think there's a lot of that going on, but that's better than not admiring the problem and just ignoring it. So that's a start, but there's a long way to go there. We've got a major copper project with our joint venture partner Rio Tinto in Arizona, a resolution copper that can provide up to 25% of US copper needs when it comes into operation. It's been stuck in the courts for a very, very long time. But it's not just that process, it's also the capital investment that goes into that, both between BHP and Rio Tinto in relation to that project. There's been about $2 billion of investment. Now, big companies like BHP, Rio, Glencore, Freeport, they can hold that. We've got the capacity to invest that capital. But if you're a smaller mining company, that makes it more difficult. And obviously you want big players in this area, but you also want smaller companies entering too. And it would be very, very difficult for a small mining company when you've got these long permitting times to be able to make those investments. When you've got lower cost of capital for bigger companies that have a very long-term horizon in relation to their investments, these smaller companies, I don't think, have that capacity. So that is a real problem for them. And also, I'd say for investors as well, in terms of if you're looking at where to invest capital globally, and you look at the mining sector, where you sit there and you look at all the regulation that's involved, the time that it takes, well, it becomes less attractive than investing in something like NVIDIA, right? So I think globally, this is a real challenge. And here in the US, I think it's a positive thing that there is admiration of the problem, but we've got to get to the next step, and that's doing something about it.
NVIDIA is a complicated place to put your money. So I want to ask you another question, Dom. I mean, Resolution Copper will be the highest ore grade copper project in the United States. It can meet 25% of our global demand, domestic demand here in the United States. Are you optimistic? I mean, this administration has really put its effort behind Resolution Copper.
Well, I make the point. I think it's been incredibly refreshing dealing with this administration in respect of critical minerals. This project has been treated like a political football for a long time. It was, in terms of moving it forward, the Obama administration did that, and the first Trump administration continued it. It was then put on hold by the Biden administration. Now it's put back on the agenda by the current administration. And from my perspective, and someone who's been in politics before, in a different country in Australia. From the last 12 months working with this administration, it's been incredibly positive in terms of their engagement, their wanting to appreciate the challenges that are in front and how they can work with industry to overcome the needs. And from our perspective as working in global mining companies, you know, we have a common pursuit, and that is to secure the critical minerals the United States needs, and they're aware of understanding the challenge and working with industry to get these projects moving as quickly as possible. And I think it's also pleasing to see that there, in many ways, is a bipartisan nature and support for getting critical minerals off the ground faster. There might be different motivations behind it, but ultimately I think everyone is singing off the same hymn book when it comes to wanting to get it done. It's just working towards solutions that will ultimately achieve it. I think the issue that Jared Agen raised this morning in respect of litigation is also, you know, incredibly important. And obviously the legal system plays an important role in making sure the right regulatory framework is abided by and supported. But when you end up in court for so long, it does make it incredibly challenging to get these projects off the ground. I mean, our Resolution Copper project ended up all the way up in the Supreme Court against the US government. It was then knocked out of the Supreme Court, and I thought the word Supreme Court, the trick would be in the name, and that was the Supreme Court of the land, and therefore that would be that. Not so the case. We're back at it again, and so it does make it incredibly challenging. But I think there are ways in which the US government, and I understand, you know, there are lawmakers have bills before Congress at the moment in terms of judicial reform, as Jared has spoken about, and I think that's incredibly important. There are countries around the world that have courts set aside, particularly for mining projects or areas where the government at a certain point in time deems to be critical for their defence and national and energy security. And I think there are ways in which you can not skirt around the law and processes, but ultimately streamline and make more efficient the legal system here when dealing with these matters to get projects moving faster, because you just end up in appeal after appeal after appeal. And ultimately, I think change needs to be made in that space, as I said, not to get around the law, but to improve the efficiency in which these matters are dealt with.
And it's also interesting, as Raheem mentioned this, is that getting the courts right, getting the judicial reform right ends up becoming a de-risking tool, because you reduce the amount of time it takes before, you know, we can't wait 30 years to get our money back.
Well, that's right.
Start making money.
And ultimately, you want these projects to occur. You know, let's take environmental regulation. There is a great advantage of having as many of these projects occurring in the United States, occurring in jurisdictions which have, you know, low corruption risk, strong environmental protections, strong labour laws in place as well to increase people's standards of living. Right? These are the jurisdictions where you want to promote mining to occur, but ultimately you can't let perfection be the enemy of the good here. You know, we've got to get the balance right. I think jurisdictions around the world are struggling with this, but ultimately working with industry, we can ensure that you have mining that's occurring in places with strong environmental practices. And I think particularly with leading global companies, that if you look at the last 50 years, you are really seeing higher environmental protections in place. You know, we call closed mine sites legacy assets, right? But you know, and one of the things that I've learned in this role is, and had the great opportunity to visit many sites that BHP operates, and they're fantastic examples of strong environmentalism. And I think, you know, in many ways, people have a view of mining. I often say this is like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, you know, underground tinkering away. Ultimately, you know, technology has come a long way. Environmental you know, practices have come a long way, and there's some very good stories out there in terms of rehabilitation that comes off the back of mining. We need to tell these stories more. As we've said already in this panel, copper is crucial. We need it in everyday life, and ultimately you've got mining standards that have increased drastically too. We just need to make sure that we get these processes through the courts as quickly as possible so we can get on with it.
Can I ask one question? I'll open it up to all three of you here, is how do we ensure, one of the reasons we play football with mining sector politically is because there's different weights placed on things like the environment and social ESG, environmental social governance. How do we ensure durabilities of projects where we can accelerate permitting, but without the trade-off of increasing the amount of negative externalities generated by these projects, such that a political change could potentially disrupt a project? Because Seth, you've seen this happen.
Yeah, I mean, look, to Dom's point, I mean, some bipartisanship is going to be essential here. And some of that is incumbent on us as industry to do what we're doing now, which is the storytelling to help people understand why this is important. Because in many ways, this is turning into, it's almost like the patient capital story, right? So we're going to need society to really get on board with this being important, and that's why we have to drill down on why everything they uses copper, for instance, or anything else. In terms of the durability, yeah, I mean, it's tough, and I don't think anyone in this room or anywhere else has a solution to our politics necessarily, but the more we can keep talking to each other across the aisle, and we're starting to see green shoots there, I think we'll have some potential for durable legislation. I think the SPEED Act is a good start. And we saw some permitting reform get through in the last Congress as well. So I think we keep building on that. And then we also have to get the states on board. You have to engage the states. This is a multi-state thing as well. It's not just the federal story. So whether it's Arizona, whether it's Minnesota, other states as well, helping state governors and their teams understand the reality here, getting state legislators on board. A lot of people don't realize your state legislator, they might not be the most prominent person in politics, but in 10 years they could be a US senator. And so getting these ideas in the bloodstream of our politics are incredibly important.
You know, I'll just add, I mean, you know, Dom raised an important point. At the end of the day, the question is, do you want to build it here or not? And it's really not just about mines, right? It's about everything. You know, people don't want the data centers now in their neighborhood because of, you know, but, you know, so where do you want it? Or renewable technologies, you know, politically unpopular right now, but, you know, we need more electricity. So at the end of the day, you know, we all have to ask ourselves, if we want these things and we want to build them here, well, then we got to figure out ways to do it faster. And the SPEED Act is one way. You know, there's you know, other efforts on the Hill looking at how they can, you know, all sides can win, and it's politically agnostic for the future.
So I want to come to another topic. Let's shift direction a little bit. America has a lot of copper, but is the copper story of meeting future security a U.S. and allies partner, a U.S. or allies partner, or is it a U.S. only?
It's U.S. and partners.
Why?
So copper demand in the U.S. is about 1.6 million tons. We can, you know, 1.2 million we can get. We have to import about 570-something thousand tons of that. I'll give you a very tangible example. We have the Horn smelter in northern Quebec province of Canada. It's one of 3 smelters in North America. You guys have one too, of course. We think that that's a really exciting ecosystem to preserve and maintain, because you can take and this ties into recycling, you can take your phones and tablets, e-scrap, e-waste, et cetera, that moves up to Canada. It could be sorted, you know, turned into materials that then sent to our refinery, which we have. 99.99% pure copper comes back to the US. And the reason I give you all that detail is that's an established ecosystem within North America with an ally, with a treaty partner in Canada that's preserving US security of copper supply. There are going to be other opportunities as well. I know our companies are looking at Argentina, the DRC as well, where we are the largest Western operator, copper and cobalt. So I think we really need to consider our partners as part of the puzzle here.
Definitely agree with Seth, both. And that has to be true, because demand is much greater than what you can actually pull out of the ground in the US. Now, I think that gap that Seth spoke about can close, and if any country in the world is going to close that gap, it's the United States, with technology advancements, opportunities of now looking at different things like recycling. So I think that gap can certainly close over time, but ultimately that gap is too high. And in any event, you know, so that gap's too high to fill the void. You want to continue to drive domestic supply, and I think we've seen during the pandemic and in other situations in the past that whether it's resources or other areas which impacts your energy, defence, security, you want to make sure you've got a very, very strong domestic supply of those things that are crucial to the security of a country without having to rely on partners. Now, that will never be perfect, but I think you certainly want to be doing that in case future challenges come the way of the world, come the way of the US, that you need to have a very, very strong domestic supply in a whole range of things. So in terms of partners, I think there's a real opportunity to continue to focus on that, where you can look at allied countries, and particularly those that are very close jurisdictionally. Seth raised Argentina, we're investing, but I look at Chile, for example, where we've got the biggest copper operation in the world, Escondida there. I mean, Chile is a jurisdiction which provides a significant amount of copper cathodes into the United States, and is obviously jurisdictionally close, but also from an allied perspective is there as well. So I think there's a real opportunity as well where countries can work together. The US can work with other jurisdictions in relation to global standards, where you can actually get, I think, alignments and synergies in relation to what we expect when it comes to that previous topic we spoke about in terms of labour laws, environmental protections, corruption risks and things like that, where countries can work together to help each other when it comes to energy security in the critical mineral space, and particularly copper. But I don't think any jurisdiction can do it alone. The US is no different to that. And so my 2 points here would be, you've got to drive domestic supply for your own energy and defence security, number one. And number two, work with those countries to help you do it. So you've got that security moving forward to fill that gap that will be very difficult to kind of close.
JJ.
Yeah, no surprise the multinationals, think it's U.S. and international, right? But the only point I'll add, look, the deposits, the rocks are where the rocks are, okay? And if we need the copper or whatever mineral, we're got to go and get it wherever it is. So, companies like ours, that's our task for, to make profits, for enhanced shareholder value, the geopolitics, security, all those things, right? So, and I think, listening to Jared this morning, he definitely recognized that, right? America first, yes, agree, but also looking at kind of ways to partnering with, international countries. And you see that reflected in how the U.S. government is approaching foreign governments right now, talking about critical minerals, copper included, so.
Minerals diplomacy has really become synonymous with U.S. foreign policy this year in a way that I personally never expected. What tools can we use to advance our mineral security interests, particularly in this hemisphere, but also places like the DRC? What tools does the U.S. government have to support industry in these jurisdictions? Some of these are relatively new jurisdictions, like Argentina. Argentina is not a major copper exporter. Some of these are high-risk jurisdictions, see no further than the DRC. How should we be thinking about what tools we can use to make these efforts easier for companies that want to go there?
I'll take a stab at it. So, I've thought about this in kind of, the hardware and the software of kind of mining, right? The hardware, the infrastructure, the roads, the electricity, the water, the transportation needs to get at a deposit or extract it to market, right? So, most mining companies don't want to build extra infrastructure that's not needed for the project. So if the U.S. government has a role to build some of that infrastructure that can enable us to go in and to then and make that additional investment for the mine, even better. On the software side, it's things like, in having kind of the right kind of investment conditions that will favor that can then look favorably on that jurisdiction. So whether it's ISDS, and we know there's certain companies that kind of need that assurance to make those multi-decade investments, or it's the right fiscal regimes that countries are kind of weighing, with mining taxes and other things. So it's if the U.S. government has a role to kind of incentivize those countries to kind of get those things right, or to show them best practices, that's kind of, the best I think the U.S. government can do. And then let us do the kind of the commercial aspects.
Seth?
Yeah, I agree with everything JJ just said. I think you're seeing some interesting tools come out, critical minerals agreements. You're seeing the DFC and the XM Bank get more involved. I think those are all very positive things. The more sophisticated we can build our U.S. apparatus for getting involved in these things, the better. I think your term of minerals diplomacy is exactly the right one, because we do need an entire work stream for this coming from the U.S. government. I also think doubling down on the last discussion about partnership, helping our international partners understand that this is a give and take, and this is a real partnership between the United States and X country. And so I think Argentina is going to be a very interesting example of that in the years ahead.
Can I ask you one question? With the DRC, I mean, you guys are basically one of the last Western companies in the DRC. What does success look like at this moment in time?
Well, I think we saw a great first step toward that with the peace deal. And I think the next step is going to be seeing increased U.S. engagement in the region. If you look, my understanding was that in the 70s, we had dozens of economic officers on the ground through the State Department and others around Congo. And we got to a point where the nadir was maybe a few. And so you didn't really have any U.S. officials, any U.S. interests there on the ground, barely any Western interests, if you will. I think hopefully we'll see an uptick in the presence of the U.S. government there. We welcome U.S. companies coming in with us into the Congo and other partners. We look forward to more partnerships there. We're extremely proud of our business in the Congo. We employ 18,000 people there, hundreds of thousands of tons of copper and cobalt is, the DRC is key for cobalt, 70%, as you know, of supply. So I think the more U.S. interest we see, and it's not just around mining, it's also U.S. business showing an interest in the country. And it's the same thing you're going to see in Argentina and Chile, et cetera, et cetera. So I think if we can see more U.S. businesses from other sectors there as well, which hopefully we'll start to see post-peace deal, it's going to get very interesting.
And you've seen a strong interest from the DRC in wanting to work with partners that are not just China as a diversification narrative in and of themselves. Dominic, I want to come to you. What are the jurisdictions that you're most excited about looking ahead?
Well, I'm here in the US, so the US. No, I'll make the point about the US because there's obviously the challenges around permitting reform and that you speak of. But one of the obviously the most attractive aspects of the United States is that once you get through all of that, I mean there's a stat that's always thrown around. From identification to extraction of a resource, the US is the second slowest in the world at 29 years, just behind Zambia. But once you're there, you've got a great environment to operate. You've got strong certainty. Whereas if you look at other jurisdictions, you might get there faster, but then you don't have that certainty, and there's obviously greater risk once you're in an operation situation. I'd say Argentina. We've made a significant investment recently in Vicuna, a site called Vicuna, which is arguably probably the biggest copper discovery in the last 30 years. And for a company like BHP, what makes Argentina, I think, attractive is that not only is it from to JJ's point, where the rocks are, right? They've got they're endowed very well with copper in a very similar way to Chile, but you've got a government at the moment with Milei who is very much focused on reducing regulation, on providing investment certainty for companies in relation to particularly critical minerals and resources. If you look at Western jurisdictions over the last 20 or 30 years, you're seeing kind of a situation where you're regulating yourself into very challenging areas. We spoke about energy prices. You've got high energy prices. You've seen a substantial increase in regulation, which is increasing the cost of capital in these jurisdictions. And it's quite refreshing to look at a jurisdiction like Argentina that is wanting to work very closely with companies to invest in the country, to lower the regulatory burden, and to provide that investment certainty over the long term. Part of they've got a 30-year focus in relation to providing certainty in respect of royalties and taxation. Seth spoke about certainty. Certainty is crucial, particularly in circumstances where you're not making a short-term investment. Companies are making investments that are decades long, and to know that what the conditions are going to be for the long term is incredibly important. And I think when you look at a country like Argentina right now, and they received a lot of criticism politically a couple of years ago I can certainly say from a BHP perspective that the approach they have to doing business in Argentina is refreshing compared to other jurisdictions globally, and it's all about lowering regulation, providing certainty. And I think they're seeing that the fruits of the rewards coming through in respect of capital investment being driven into the country.
And so I want to come back home. So this year was a big year for copper. It joined the critical minerals list, which was a really big step. And it was a really big step because it's a very powerful market signal about what the U.S. government is prioritizing. And I'd like to open this question to all three of you as we start to close up, is what concrete next steps should the U.S. take to accelerate domestic mining and refining of copper now that we're critical?
Yeah, I'll kick off. So the USGS, getting copper to critical minerals list, fantastic first step. We need more. If you've talked to me, in the past few months, we're very focused on what are the things that will incentivize companies like Freeport, like us here, to kind of make that additional investment. And there's one specific tax credit that we're just so kind of focused on right now. There was. The IRA, for all its, political baggage, there was some good things in there for critical minerals. One of them was is the 45X tax credit, advanced manufacturing and production tax credit. It has some very specific minerals that are eligible for that tax credit. Copper is not one of them. It should be. We could talk to me afterwards of why it should be and what Congress can do to kind of make it that way. But certainly that's one very specific kind of, tax credit that will then, allow companies like Freeport and others to kind of pull forward those investment decisions that might be kind of, waiting for a sustained high enough copper price, but to know that if there's kind of a tax credit that could benefit, you can pull those projects forward. So that's definitely one thing I would highlight.
Just very briefly, I can't underscore enough the importance of getting the permitting story right so that we can get New Range built, so Resolution and other projects can get through. Because once these projects are up and running, I think you'll see a whole paradigm shift. And the thing is, if we get through our permitting story and our process, and we're not alone in this, any project will be the same thing, and there is a whiplash back and forth, we're going to be having the same conversation in 10 years, except for we're going to be either further in the hole. So if we can just get that permitting thing right, we're good to go.
I think just reiterate the points that have been made on the panel so far. Permitting reform, litigation reform. I agree with JJ in relation to 45X. I think those are the kind of things when you're looking at critical minerals to bring copper into that and obviously copper's been put as a critical mineral, but make sure the same kind of incentives were there for other minerals are obviously included for copper. Couple of things. I'd say continuing to work with industry to raise the awareness with the public about the importance of critical minerals, and I think that has come a long, long way. Having discussions like this brings the public on side. Reform is hard in politics, bringing the public, and it's really important to bring the public with you, and I think there's been a much greater understanding of the importance of critical minerals and the role they play in everyday life has really picked up. I mean, over the last few years, I think if you went back, do some polling on this, that most people wouldn't appreciate how their iPhones work or what resources are required to achieve that. Everyone's using AI on their phone, but how is it going to occur? How is it going to occur in the future? Driving around with EVs. It's important that the resource industry continues to be able to do its job to enable everyday life and standards of living, both here in the United States and around the world, to continue to grow. We want, as a civilization, to continue to progress. That's what's happened throughout history, and people have always been doomsayers at various points in time in history that things will slow down, but the human race have always found ways in which to constantly increase the standards of living across the board, and resources and mining plays a fundamental role in doing that. And I think for policymakers, having the public aware of that and the importance of our industry, I think will continue to be fundamental to success. We can say we want this change or we want streamlining of processes, but not as an end to itself. Yes, there's money to be made for companies, but there's great benefits to people across the world And so, you know, I think the three of us and our companies, and we have a duty as well to be on panels like this, to be out telling the story, but ultimately to continue to work with governments to raise the profile and the importance of the industry, so that policymakers can do their job in bringing the public with them on the journey.
My final question to you all is looking ahead to 2026. I mean, 2025 has been a year of great progress, but there have also been challenges. I mean, the sunset out of 45X over time is one of the challenges that we contend with given the long-term nature of project development. But looking ahead to 2026, what is one intervention that would support the copper industry further? Are we missing anything in terms particularly around making it a more economic, but also thinking about longevity and durability? How do we ensure that the momentum from this year continues on?
Well, I'll start. I mean, I think, you know, one of the things that we need to focus on is that all these resources are different. And they need a different policy lens for each of them. And there's obviously a major focus on rare earths. You know, but if you look at the market for that, it's about 10 billion. Copper is, you know, over 200 billion. Oil and gas is over $1 trillion. And so not every resource should be treated the same. And I think from a policymaker's perspective, there needs to be the critical thinking in relation to what is needed to get each of these different resources extracted faster. And whether that's, you know, from extraction to refinery, it's not a one-size-fits-all policy approach. And that's difficult because in a perfect world it would be, and it'd be easy for policymakers to set a regulation that improves all of these things, but it's just not the case. And so I think it's, you know, I think we've come, as you say, this year I think has been a very strong year for critical minerals in terms of raising the awareness. For example, I came to the US 15 months ago. Just in that 15 or 16 months, I've seen a significant increase in the understanding and awareness amongst policymakers in relation to critical minerals. Substantial. And that we just need that momentum to continue, whether that's copper, iron ore, a whole range of rare earths that policymakers are dealing with those challenges. It's not an easy area of policy. It is complex. But I think making sure that focus and determination is there and an understanding and a deeper appreciation that the challenges with each resource is different, and looking at the policy settings for those individually. If that work is done, I think 2026 will even be better than 2025.
Thanks, JJ.
Can I say 45X again? I mean,
you can hit home an important point.
I know, no. All kidding aside, no. In addition, I mean, you know, going back to where we started, right, where we talked about copper's use in all facets of kind of technology, industrial use, you know, coming AI, electricity, all those things. I mean, fundamentally, if there's economic growth here in the U.S. and in the world, then that's good for copper, right? Remember, copper is Dr. Copper. It's a good kind of corollary to economic growth. So if you have those things, you know, firing on all cylinders here in the U.S. and around the world, then, you know, it's going to be good for copper, good for copper price. So at the end of the day, whether it's getting the AI policy right, you know, electricity generation, you know, just whatever economic growth, you know, make sure those are, you're doing those things correctly so that, you know, all rising tide lifts all boats for us, right? So.
Seth, close this out.
Yeah, I don't know how many people in the room have watched Gilded Age on HBO. It's a great show. There is a call out for copper in a couple episodes. And that just shows you that this story goes way back. And if you look at even the founding of the United States and what led to the Revolutionary War, these were resource questions in many ways. So some things don't change. What we also need to make sure doesn't change is the momentum that we've been building over the last few years and that JJ and Dom have just alluded to in terms of policy shifts and really public recognition of the importance of this stuff. So next year we're going into midterm elections. It's going to be a politically chaotic year. I think everybody just needs to remember that this stuff does not have a party label. I think we need to understand that we need copper for literally everything that we're going to do to be successful as a nation. And again, it's, you know, whether it's AI, whether it's your phone, whether it's a car, everything else, the buildings, these cameras here, the more we can keep, you know, hammering home to people that copper is in literally everything that they touch almost. If it's not mined, if it's not grown or mined, it's mined. I think the better off we'll be, and we'll be able to preserve the wins that we're going to get over the next couple of years.
Thanks so much. Please join me in giving our panelists a round of applause.